Morning. I came across a really interesting and well-known author and public speaker by the name of Simon Sinek. Some of you may know the name, some of you may not. But he's really fascinating, and he talks to a lot of businesses about how they can become better leaders. And I think it's really interesting, and he talks about a lot of stuff, and on his website, I just kind of browsed briefly, and he had a video where he said, if you walk into any bookstore, you find these tremendous sections that are self-help sections. And the self-help industry is just massive. And he's like, what you won't find in the bookstore is a help others section. He's like, it just doesn't exist. So sure enough, I did some searching and tried to find some books on that subject, helping others. And there's virtually nothing. Virtually nothing. And so I really started thinking about this, and especially as we talk about the church, and in this class in particular, we're talking about the church that's kind of plopped in the middle of this culture that's changing so rapidly. And there's so many good things, but there are also so many egregious things within our culture, and it's constantly changing. So I started looking up the self-improvement, self-help industry, and we'll look at some of this stuff, but it's pretty fascinating. It's generating a ton of revenue. So this is the website, brandminds.live. They say that the self-improvement industry is estimated to grow to $13.2 billion by next year. According to market research, the self-improvement market was worth $9.9 billion in 2016, and it's estimated to grow to $13.2 billion by 2022. So that has a 5.6% average yearly gain. So it's steadily growing, and it has been over at least the last decade. Here's another website. This is grandviewresearch.com. They have a report. The global personal development market size was valued at $38.28 billion in 2019. So the first was U.S., 13 billion U.S., 38 billion worldwide, and expected to grow at a compound annual growth rate of 5.1%, which is pretty in line with what the last report was, from 2020 to 2027. Increasing consciousness about self-recognition and the pursuit of happiness is expected to drive the demand for personal development programs during the forecast period. Let me translate. People are very broken. People are very depressed. People are very hurt. People are very numbed by drugs and alcohol. And so people see this as an opportunity to tap into the self-help market. Incidentally, I looked this up too, and I visited a couple different websites, the CDC, et cetera, et cetera. This is from the Washington Post, and the title of this article is U.S. Life Expectancy Declines Again, a Dismal Trend Not Seen Since World War I. Anybody want to take any guess before I scroll down? What's causing the lifespan in the U.S. to plummet? I don't even know how to respond to that. What? Death? Yeah. Thanks, Dave. Boy, you guys are really helpful today. This is amazing. I don't know why I spent time on this. I should have just had you guys. Roxanne hit the nail on the head. Drugs, suicide, depression. That's at the top of the list. Not just drugs, but of course all the aftermath from that. Unemployment, yes. Yeah, I don't know. To be honest, I didn't read the whole report, but that certainly has to factor in. Yeah, abortion. But I don't know. You know, it's interesting. I don't know if they factor that into these kinds of studies, which is, I think, actually sad. Because I've seen other studies where they put abortion at the top of the list for death. millions and millions every single year. So yeah, with drugs, you have unemployment, you have perpetual issues. I was just talking to somebody on the phone last night, and they were saying that we can't get any employees to work for us because of drugs, because of unemployment. Yeah, they can't find workers because of drugs. It's a major issue, and people don't want to show up to work. The same person I talked to told me that one of their employees that they did hire died of an overdose at work. And one of the other workers, who was also high, found the employee who had overdosed. This is a perpetual, chronic issue. The other thing is, obviously eating habits. If you look at the health in the United States, we are not the healthiest bunch of people in the world. We brag that we have the best health care in the world, but health care isn't really valuable, or it's not of much value if we're gross. And we're pretty gross in this country. The stuff that we eat, it's not very good. So I'm going to scroll down just a little bit. See if we can find. Okay, here we go. So rates of suicide and drug overdoses. Again, Roxanne hit the nail on the head. So Roxanne, if you would pat yourself on the back and give yourself one. Oh, you can't. You're holding a baby. Okay. I'll do it for you. All right. Rates of suicide and drug overdoses continue to climb. Look at the rates. These are percentages. Deaths per 100,000 people. An increase of 22.4%. Drug overdose deaths, 29%. This is from 1999 to 2017. Look at that increase. Dramatic increases. So here's the question. If people are dying sooner, if people are getting sicker, if at the same time the personal development, the self-help stuff is increasing dramatically, why such the skew? If we're improving ourselves, if we're getting better and we have this wonderful self-improvement and self-worth and all this stuff, if this market is just flooded with these self-help gurus, why are we dying? Why are we addicted to drugs and alcohol? Why are we depressed? Why are the suicide rates dramatically increasing along with the drug addictions and alcohol? Why the discrepancy? Yeah, it's a big part of it. What about the other side of that? What about helping other people? Right? If you think about this, and let me frame this in a different way. How has this notion of self-help? Well, first of all, let me back up. What happens whenever we are focused on improving self, if that becomes our focus? Not that it's a bad thing, because I'm all for improving ourselves, but if that's the focus.
I think that the churches have gotten away from going ahead and helping others, because right now, the concept in this country seems to let the government do it. And so we as churches have failed those in our community by just letting the government do things when we are the ones that God has told for us to go out and help.
Yeah, I'll take that even a step further. There have been churches who've tried to stand counter to government helping with everything, because the government, right? Government housing, government food, welfare, food stamps. All those things in themselves are not bad. It's okay to take care of people who need help. But some churches and Christians have tried to say, well, you know what, we need to do our part as well. And they do, food banks and things like that. And I've seen the government come in and shut those down and say, you don't have the right permits. Like, we actually worried about that when we were serving food here. I had to put a bunch of phone calls in and make sure that we weren't going to get fined for serving food to the public because of health issues. I had to talk to food inspectors and all this stuff. And I was told by somebody who inspects different places And I kid you not, and I can say this now because we're not doing it anymore, I was told directly by somebody who inspects organizations, let sleeping dogs lie. As long as people don't complain, just keep your head low. And I was like, well, okay, like I'm for that, but what if somebody outs us for serving food and not having the right permits? Like, are we going to get fined? Are we going to get shut down? Because if that's the case, then we can't do it. And he assured me that, no, you guys are good, you guys are okay, your town doesn't require all these permits. But there are places that do, where you literally can't help people. We talked about it last week in California. There's a guy who's making these little miniature houses, and he was shut down by the city of Los Angeles. They will not let him build structures for homeless people. So, all of these are issues, but I think when we really focus on the self-help thing, and that starts to leak into the church, we forget that there's a whole other world of hurting, broken people out there who are desperate for help. And so in our loneliness and in our alienation and in our poverty and whatever it is, we're just trying to survive. And I think that's why this market is so appealing to people. The self-help market, like they're really preying on people so that they get richer. And the poor people, the desperate people, the sick people, the depressed people are sinking all their money into these resources, and they're not getting any better.
I think you look at our focus. God tells us we're to focus as on Him, first. So if we're so focused on ourselves and spending all this time, money, and effort on self-help, I don't know if there's much time left or even concern enough to focus on others.
Yeah.
Might get a small few of people that it might help. I think the most of that, it doesn't fill that need they're searching for.
Yeah.
So you go get another self-help guy and another.
It's interesting you say that because, there's, I've read a couple just short articles on this, and I don't know how in depth, there's big studies or whatever on this. I don't even know if those exist, but I've read articles where people talk about the addiction of self-help. So, you buy one self-help book and you just consume it because you're so desperate to improve your job, improve your performance, improve whatever. And you become addicted to that, where you read the first book and you get a little bit of gas to go for a while, but then you run out of steam and you're like, okay, now I got to buy the course, right? Because the book only helped me so far. But here's the thing, psychologically speaking, and I understand a little bit about marketing, it's designed that way. It's called hooks. In marketing, they call them hooks. So you find a way to hook someone, and then when somebody's hooked, they become addicted to your brand, and so you just start, then it's the course. And then after the course, it's the personal consulting and the coaching, and from there it's the workshops and in-person workshops. So then it's the retreat where you got to pay prime dollar, $3,000 for a weekend retreat because that's going to be the pinnacle moment. So people are being built for thousands and thousands of dollars individually, and they're not improving, at least generally. So I think one of the things that's interesting, I think if we take a step back and we look at what's going on in the church culture, a lot of the church culture is subscribing to that kind of a model where it's, come here and you will get what? Yeah, you'll get help, you'll get fed. You'll find yourself, I look at marketing of churches, and I've visited hundreds of churches' websites. And I find this theme among emerging, growing churches. Not all of them, but most of them. And that message is this really strong message that if you come here, only we can satisfy your specific needs. All these other churches, you can get closer to God, but what we have to offer is so unique. And they're marketing this package where it's all this self-help stuff. Like, your faith will grow. You'll be closer to God. Some of them, certainly in the wealth and health gospel, the prosperity gospel, come here and your bank account will increase. I tell people, you come here, your bank account will decrease. Especially when the plate comes around. I mean, got to get that tip money from somewhere. But you know what I mean? Like, we've slowly adopted this poisonous self-help, addictive, creating this addiction to the church because that's what gets people to come back. And there are marketing teams at churches that's their job, is to put hooks in people. And to make sure, and they have this process where they come through the door, you hand them, give them a free gift. And, we used to we handed things out when people came in. Wendy, I know you've talked about that before. Like, that was something that helped you to come back. But ours wasn't a gimmick. Like, we didn't have any motive that if we give this item, like people actually market which items they give people. And there's a psychology behind it. And the churches that are doing that are manipulating people. It's better just to give things just because you actually care than to create this hook where you're trying to get people to come back. And once they do that, then offer them this, and then that'll kind of whet their palate a little bit more. And then it's like this little carrot stick in front of the horse that you keep dangling that, and you're trying to draw people into the church instead of working with people and actually helping them, helping others, and leading people to Christ. So I want to look at some of these passages because it's so counter to what that self-help culture is. This is Colossians chapter 3, verses 12 through 17. Put on then as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, compassionate hearts, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience. Bearing with one another. You want to know how grueling that is? Right? Like, the self-help stuff is all about getting your cup filled and making sure that you find the right place that's going to fill you up, where people pump you up and they're just always telling you nice things. This passage is like what I hear Paul saying here is, you're among a bunch of misfits. Like, really, some of the people are going to be poisonous. Grin and bear it. Bear each other's problems. Bear with one another. Get along. Figure it out. And then he says, if one has a complaint against another, forgiving each other as the Lord has forgiven you, so you must also forgive. Do you want to know how grueling that is? When somebody complains against you, to forgive that person. Now, this isn't sinning against each other. I talk about that. This instant forgiveness, this idea of we have to forgive everybody no matter what they've done. That's not a biblical concept at all. But there's a difference between somebody intentionally sinning against you and doing that serially and unrepentantly, and somebody who complains about you. Paul here puts this in this category of somebody who's just a nuisance. If somebody complains about you, forgive each other. As the Lord has forgiven you, so also you must forgive. And above all these, put on love, which binds everything together in perfect harmony. And let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, to which indeed you are called in one body, and be thankful. Let the word of Christ dwell in you richly, teaching and admonishing one another in all wisdom, singing psalms and hymns and spiritual songs with thankfulness in your hearts to God. And whatever you do, in word or deed, do everything in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to the Father through him. Does this sound like self-help? Not to me. Or does this sound like others' help? right? This is all, where's the focus? It's on other people. It's on building other people up. It's on encouraging other people, teaching them, admonishing them, forgiving them.
Which is self-help.
Yeah, it really is. In the end, ironically, that's the definition of self-help, is helping others. Do unto others as you would have be done unto you, right? It's not about building yourself up and finding your own inner.
I mean, what Bob said and what you're saying is all good, but the big thing that I get out of here is thankfulness. Like, it's not just thankfulness is throughout the whole thing.
Yeah.
And in a way, that is self-help, because how do you get into the right attitude? How do you feel good about yourself?
Yeah.
Not if you're complaining about everything, not
Yeah.
if you're griping about everything, not if you're just a complainer.
You're never satisfied. Yeah. Yeah.
You have to be thankful, and that will help others and you.
Yeah. Yeah.
God knows what we need.
Yeah, absolutely. Hebrews 13:16, do not neglect to do good and to share what you have, for such sacrifices are pleasing to God. Well, what does sacrifice mean? What is a sacrifice? What does it mean to sacrifice? Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you claim no ownership to it whatsoever. Whether it's yourself, offer yourself up. Right? Romans chapter 12, Paul says, offer your body as a sacrifice. This pleasing aroma to God. Jesus says, if you want to be called my disciple, what's the first thing? Deny what? Deny yourself. That's not consuming all these self-help things to make yourself better. Jesus says, deny yourself. Deny yourself. Take up your cross daily, which means what? Be willing to die. You sacrifice yourself and follow me. And then he says, anybody who doesn't do these things cannot be called my disciple. You cannot be called my follower. I mean, this is polar opposite of what both culture and many churches are doing and saying. This notion of, if you come in, we are going to just fill you up. We're going to keep filling your cup. And once you get out there, you're going to find yourself deflated, but then come back and, we're going to build you up. It's this addictive cycle where people become dependent on the church. That really isn't supposed to be. That's not a biblical model. That's not a healthy model. That's not a good model. And that's why a lot of these churches are self-imploding right now. They're imploding because that also lends itself to narcissistic, what? Narcissistic leadership. Because then the leaders end up being the people that they're like, this church won't exist without me. Or the church will say, we can't exist without you. That's not a healthy model. That's not a biblical model. No church should be dependent on any one leader or a group of leaders. Philippians chapter 2, verses 3 through 8. Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you look not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others. Have this in mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men. And being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Listen to this. How did Jesus spend his ministry? What was he doing? Yeah, constantly, to the point of exhaustion. I don't think Jesus ever went to bed being like, man, that was a rockin' service that we just had, And I still remember one of my He was one of my professors and also the vice president and also the dean, also Natalie's mom's cousin of my grad school. That was messed up. You guys, the only C that I got in graduate school was from Natalie's mom's cousin. I'm just going to throw that out there. And it was right after I got perfect grades in his class until I started dating Natalie. And then my grades, I'm not kidding, I'm totally, like I still talk to him about that. I'm like, Dr. Hufford, do you remember when I started dating Natalie and you gave me those horrible grades? Anyway, that was just a little sore spot that I wanted to, bring up. But Dr. Hufford, one of the things that really stuck out to me was a talk that he did where he talked about Moses in the desert. He leads, there's this pinnacle moment where Moses is responsible for an entire nation. Moses brought them out of Egypt, parted the sea, through this whole miraculous process, which Moses resisted, right? Because he said, I'm not the one. I can't talk. I don't have good speech. Moses leads Israel over into the desert. And for 40 years, they wandered. Now, we've been in a pandemic for a year, right? Just kind of wandering. We didn't know when kids were going back to school, and that was driving me insane. Blood was coming out of my eyes, and it was this awful thing not knowing. We don't wander well. For 40 years, here were Moses' instructions from God. This was his mission for 40 years. Whenever you see the cloud, whenever you see this cloud of fire pick up and move, you pick up and move. That's it. Pending further instructions, yep. For 40 years, the Israelites lived that way. Okay, how long do we stay camped out here? Could be a year, could be 10 years. Whenever I move, you move. That's it. Sing it. Yeah, belt it out. And Dr. Hufford talked about that, and he said, we become so addicted to these meaningful, powerful worship services that if they don't move us, if we don't feel the Spirit working in us, if we don't feel this joy when we walk out of the doors, if we don't feel this the chills on your arms when we sing songs, if we don't feel lifted up, and if we don't feel like our cup's being filled, and if we don't feel this deep connection with God and with each other, then we better move to the next church where we feel that, because that's a dead church. Right? And so Dr. Hufford talked about that, and he said, with Moses, do you think ever in that 40 years that there was a worship service where they're jumping up and down and raising their hands to Jesus? I think that worship in the desert was both a duty and a chore. It was a sacrificial worship where they're worshiping to God who's being silent. God, it's not like God is talking to Moses every day and talking to the Israelites, and they have this wonderful back and forth communication. God, his instructions to the leader of this whole nation was, when I pick up and move, you follow. Can you imagine the outrage from the people? Saying, all right, Moses, we've been doing this for 20 years, man. Surely there's got to be a better way to do church out here in the desert. Surely God, who we witnessed split the waters, right? It was that generation. They walked across dry land with the ocean on both sides of them. Those people were now in the desert doing this for 40 years. And Moses was leading them. So, I think this is such an important lesson because we developed this model that says that the church has to be vibrant. It has to be uplifting. It has to be deeply spiritual and deeply connected to God and to each other. And it's based on this self-help model that its whole intention from the very onset is to hook people and to get people coming back. Instead of equipping people, which is our theme this year, right? Equipping the saints for what? Yeah, works of service, works of ministry, to minister to other people, to help others. It's an outward-focused, other-focused model, which is incredibly biblical. And then this last passage, we'll close with this. So this is Jesus talking about the separation of the sheep and the goats. And he says, he's pretty explicit. He's like, the sheep go to heaven, the goats go to hell, right? That's a song too.
Yeah, but my song isn't holy.
I'd like to hear you sing both of those songs. But Jesus is saying, there's this, with God sitting on the judgment seat, there's this radical separation of people. This is what separates people. Ultimately, when you come before the judgment seat of God, there's this radical line in the sand that God draws and says, okay, you guys go this way, and you guys go this way. Okay, what is that line in the sand? What's the test of our salvation? Verse 35, for I was hungry, and he gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me. And then the righteous will answer him, saying, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you drink? And when did we see you a stranger and welcome you, or naked and clothe you? And when did we see you sick or in prison and visit you? And the king will answer them, truly I say to you, as you did it to one of the least of these, of my brothers, you did it to me. I mean, that is what separates the righteous from the unrighteous, the godly from the ungodly, the faithful to the unfaithful, the saved to the damned. This is what separates them. It has nothing to do with how vibrant or powerful or meaningful our worship is. It has, not that those things don't matter. Again, I always want to clarify that because I am the biggest proponent of having a worship service that connects, that's good, but that's not why we're here. That's not what determines whether this is a healthy congregation or not. This body of believers, our health is not dependent at all on what our Sunday morning worship service looks like. It's not. And we need to remember that there's this underwhelming idea that the person who is righteous and saved is somebody who rolls up their sleeves and just helps others. Period. That is the most underwhelming picture of what Christianity looks like to from a self-help perspective. That's the most underwhelming. You mean that's it? You mean for 40 years we're going to be in the desert? Just God says, pick up and follow me, and we go, and we help people, and we clothe people, and we feed people, and we take care of their needs, and we visit the sick. That's it? That's exhausting. And what Jesus is saying in this passage is, yes, those people will come to the judgment seat of my Father, and my Father will say, well done, my good and faithful servant. And while this seems underwhelming to us, This is overwhelming for people who are in crisis. If you don't believe me, send a card. Just send a card. Just send a 41 or 42 or 47 or however much money stamps are now. I don't ever know because they're forever stamps. They used to stamp the number on. They're what, 45? 50? Holy cow. See if I ever mail cards to any of you anymore. But spend 55 cents on a stamp and $1 on a card and just write a short message and send that to somebody who is in desperation and see what that does to that person. To you, you're like, it's just a card. To that person, it's overwhelming. It's a huge deal. And it's this shift in perspective where instead of having the church be this self-help blob that we're trying to suck everything out of, we need to turn that around and say there are people all around us who are absolutely critical. I mean, I know Bob and Tex have been talking to Rick. I talked to Megan for an hour on Friday afternoon, and I'm telling you, just having a conversation with somebody who's in just their wit's end. They're just desperate. They're lonely. They're hurt. They're broken. They're sapped dry. Those conversations are what people remember. It's overwhelming to those people when it's underwhelming to us. I'm going to close there. We'll pick back up in a few minutes. Thank you, guys.